All right, everybody, we're live.
Okay, well, good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us for History Matters, and so does coffee, where we've been meeting. I have to keep saying this because I'm still so proud of us since April of 2020. So long-standing history community here. Today we are going to talk about impeachment, a little bit about impeachment itself, and then also what I was more interested in talking about is what it means above and beyond the fact of conviction, which obviously we focus on for good reason, but I think impeachment is important for a lot of other reasons. So that's what I want to talk about today. But before I do that, as always, I will turn things over to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to History Matters and So Does Coffee. Week 40-something. Let's go with that. Yeah. Rules of the game are as follows.
44. Carol Lee says 44.
44. See, it gets technical because I think this is episode 41, but we have 3 weeks of special episodes too. So that's where we get a little tricky. 44. That's incredible. Well, welcome everybody. And so the rules of the game are pretty simple. We ask that you please have lots of robust conversation in the chat. Make sure that you do click on all panelists and attendees so everybody can see what you're saying, not just me and Joanne. And as always, keep it family friendly and germane to the conversation. If you do have questions, make sure you put them in the Q&A. That is where we take questions during the Q&A section a little bit later, here in about a half hour-ish. So if you put them in chat, we're probably going to miss them, so just make sure to put them in the Q&A for that part of the show. And as always, if you like what we're doing here at the National Council of History Education, please join us. You can go to our website, www.ncheteach.org, and look around. We have lots of great content, always adding to it. Lots of great programming. So we got some good things on the horizon as well, some great programming. We're envisioning a world where we're not all cooped up in COVID world. We're envisioning a time when we'll be able to work together in person again, and you'll be seeing some of that programming soon. Additionally, the registration for the Sarah Vowell event on March 10th will be coming out in the next, so let's say 4 or 5 days. So you can look for that. And then finally, as you know, we do have our conference coming up here in a couple, about a month and a half, 2 months. So beginning of April, and it's the 5th through the 8th through the 11th, I think. One note on that, there is a very special episode of History Matters and So Does Coffee. Somebody asked, what are we going to do for our 1-year anniversary? We are doing an evening show, which we're very excited to finally announce. We're calling it History Matters and So Do Cocktails. So that will be an exciting event that will happen April 8th. Which is the 365th day since we started the show. And it'll be at 8:30 at night Eastern time. So we're looking forward to
You should all join us for History Matters and So Does Cocktails, which in my mind is History Matters and So Does Bourbon. But that's got some rough edges, so we can totally.
It really does. All right. With that, I will turn it over to Joanne for our conversation today.
Okay. I'm going to that. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. So impeachment is the topic today. I'm going to change the view because this is just weird. Okay. So for obvious reasons, I want to talk about impeachment today. But I want to talk about it, I suppose, partly because as I said at the outset, it's really logical that the focus is on conviction and crime in a really formal sense. And I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot of that now that we're hearing the other side of the argument during the trial in the Senate. What I wanted to talk about was in part just actual impeachment, to actually read the section of the Constitution that describes it, to talk about why it was important, why people considered it important at the time, to talk about some of the things that people assumed or didn't assume that we might not or might be taking for granted, and then just talk just briefly about the other things that I think impeachment accomplishes, which we're experiencing right now, whether we're sort of consciously thinking about them or not. So let's start out with the beginning, the obvious, which is Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution, which reads, "The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors." Now, I'm going to come back to high crimes and misdemeanors shortly. But basically, the president, vice president, and all civil officers, and by civil officers, it does not mean members of Congress, but it actually does mean officers in a formal kind of a sense. The reason why impeachment was considered so important has to do with one of the main fears that people had at the time of writing the Constitution. Well, the big fear, and the thing that the Federal Convention, the Constitutional Convention, was really about was power. Right? Where does power go? Who has power? That was the main concern. And of course, having just had a revolution where the nation had broken away from a king who was considered to be tyrannical, an executive with a lot of power felt particularly threatening. So the president, what the president should be as an office, how much power the president should have, and how a president could be held in check were really vital core issues. I mean, it's interesting to note that for a time, there was discussion in the Federal Convention of having a presidency that consisted of more than one person, with the thought being, okay, then it won't be just one person who has power, we'll divide it up between people. That idea was shot down in part because, and I think it might be Hamilton who made this argument, but certainly someone made the argument that if there's three people, then one of them could do wrong and then hide behind the other two, and we would never know who used power improperly because they could hide behind each other. So, and also that in many ways probably would not be the most efficient way to use executive power, but the fact that it was talked about shows you the degree to which they were worried about giving a lot of power to one individual. Now, obviously, that the system of checks and balances in a general way, you know, they're checking and balancing power. That's what is being checked and balances. I think we're so used to the phrase checks and balances that we don't think about what is being checked. But it is power. And impeachment was seen as a fundamental, if not the fundamental, check on executive power, right? That it holds an executive, it holds the president accountable for his actions. It's kind of in a sense, a threat that's held out, and then an action that can be taken. And I'll quote you one or two people from the time who talked about what they were thinking about impeachment when they were talking about it. Elbridge Gerry, so it's gerrymandering, and it's named after Elbridge Gerry. And I don't know when the G decided that it was going to be different in both cases, but it is Elbridge Gerry. He stated when impeachment was being discussed that it was needed vitally as a check against presidential abuse of power. And these are his words. "A good magistrate will not fear impeachments. A bad one ought to be kept in fear of them," right? So it literally, the idea of impeachment is supposed to be a threat, never mind just the fact of it. George Mason also weighed in. He said, "No point is of more importance than that the right of impeachment should be continued. Shall any man be above justice?" That's the question, right? So they're saying pretty bluntly some of what I'm saying to you here, even as they're putting it into the Constitution, debating how it fits in, what it'll look like, what the language will be, how it will be enacted. Now, interestingly, initially, they had, treason, bribery, and the first word that was suggested in addition to treason and bribery was maladministration, right? That you can be impeached for treason, bribery, and maladministration, which is interesting because that's a really broad term, right? Maladministration, the reason why that ended up not being the word in the Constitution is because it can mean almost anything, right? And it can mean basically, if Congress just doesn't like something the president does, then it's maladministration. So they decided that that was too broad, and they went instead to high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, that said, that phrase, some people in interpreting that phrase assume, because it has the word crime in it, that what that's saying is that there has to be a judicial crime at the heart of impeachment. And that's also not quite what they meant. The phrase is deliberately fuzzy, and I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. But they didn't invent the idea of high crimes and misdemeanors. It had hundreds of years of British usage, and much of British usage, it was not used against the king, but the king's officers could be impeached. I guess you can't really impeach a king. But still, the Americans had the British example before them. Colonies in their governments had, at least many of them, had a system of impeachment as well. So the Constitutional Convention, in debating this, had precedents that it was toying with and thinking about when it was coming up with impeachment. And high crimes and misdemeanors was a way of not just saying stuff we don't like in the president, but was still broad enough to encompass situations down the road that might justify impeachment. Let's see if I can find this phrase, and I might not be able to find it. Here we go. So in 1861, during the Johnson impeachment, Newby has a lot to say about impeachment. Someone said in 1861 during Andrew Johnson's impeachment, when they were talking about what justified impeachment or not, someone said, you know, what if someone, not Lincoln, but someone, whether moved by fear or an honest but perverted political theory, refused to mobilize the Union against the rebellion? Would we say the only remedy in such a case was to allow dissolution of the country because the president's inaction was no crime? Right. So this is actually Benjamin Butler who's saying this. And what Butler is saying is, okay, so there's a secession, right? States secede from the Union. And let's say the president, whoever it is, didn't act on that, whether that's for fear or an honest but perverted political theory. That's not a crime. So what does that mean? Is there no way to take any action against that particular moment? Butler is saying, no, of course there is. We're not talking about judicial crimes. There is a judicial system that can try presidents and anyone else for judicial crimes, but they're toying with and still debating the idea we're debating now, but that was the way that they were debating it at the time. It's not just criminal. And Hamilton, what's been interesting, put this over here, what's been interesting since the first impeachment, which is just an amazing sentence to say about one administration. But at the first impeachment, there was a lot of really interesting talk, of course, by pundits about what was meant by impeachment. And one of the things that people pointed to, and that we're still getting some echoes of now, has to do with the fact that impeachment is political. And sometimes the way that people are using that now or describing that now is to say, and I believe this was explicitly said, I can't remember by who, during the last impeachment, was that Hamilton warned that there should be no impeachment because it was political. Like, impeachment is bad because it's political, which is a total, which was not said. I was going to say, which is the opposite of what was said, which is just nonsense. What Hamilton says, he does acknowledge it's a big punishment. It's an important tool. And he says, let me get his words here. Impeachable offenses arise from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, are from the abuse or violation of a public trust. They're political offenses, meaning they relate chiefly to injuries done to society itself. Hamilton wasn't saying impeachment is bad because it's political and partisan and we shouldn't do it. He was saying impeachment is political because it has to do with offenses against society, a president committing an offense against the general good or American society. And by definition, those sorts of actions are political. So, you know, since we've been meeting here, our 44 weeks, who knew that I was going to keep coming back to, you know, accountability, words are important, emotions. This is a case of words being important. And people in a really partisan moment, and obviously impeachment is going to be those kinds of moments, cherry picking about, you know, through the Federalist Essays and any number of other things, to find something that they can hang on to. Not a new behavior, not unique to this moment, but really important to think about words, not necessarily so that we can sort of revert to constitutional originalism, that every word as it was meant at the time must be considered, but that the language of it matters, and you have to at least think about it and read it and consider it when deciding how to act, and not deliberately pervert it into meaning something that it was never meant. I will also add, actually, not directly related to what we're talking about, but I just was talking about this with my students this last week in my lecture course. The Federalist Essays, when I was digging around this morning, trying to decide what I wanted to say and Googling around as one does, I saw a number of people, authority sources, referring to the Federalist Essays as essentially constitutional scripture, right? Like we have the Constitution and we have the Federalist Essays to really show us what the Constitution means. And I feel the need to make an important point about that, which is that, yes, the Federalist Essays were written by people who were part of the Federal Convention, were part of the debates, had strong views about what it meant. But what's always important to remember about those Federalist Essays is that they were never intended to be objective analyses of parts of the Constitution. That was not their intention. I say to my students, and this is a crass way of putting it, but I'm going to say it anyway, that the Federalist Essays were kind of a commercial advertisement for the Constitution. They were meant to be persuasive documents. They were people basically saying, let me tell you why the Constitution is so wonderful. Here, actually, I did that during my lecture yesterday. Let me show you this Constitution. It's excellent, with an 800 number on the bottom of the screen. It was the essays were a kind of advertisement. Doesn't mean that they were fake. Doesn't mean that they were just lies. But it also doesn't mean that they're absolutely objective. And the reason I talked about that in my lecture course this last week, I was talking about the Articles of Confederation, and I was talking about the fact that they get kind of a bum rap because we see them as a stupid training wheels form of government because we know the Constitution's coming, and the Federalist Essays do an excellent job of showing how stupid the articles are, but that in fact, the Federalist Essays do an axe job on the Articles of Confederation to prove how horrible they are so that we really need the Constitution. So that's kind of a detour, but I feel the need to say it because I really do think that so many people, and I saw it online today bopping around, use the Federalists to be absolutely objective, and they aren't. Doesn't mean we shouldn't use them, doesn't mean they're not important, doesn't mean that even at the time, people considered them an important source of information about the Constitution and intentions of the people writing it, but we shouldn't take them as scripture. We should bear in mind the context for the writing of them. You know, there's a, I quoted a lot over the course of the last almost year, Pennsylvania Senator William McClay's diary. He's in the first Senate. It's this amazing diary. And one of the things, it's a throwaway line in his diary, but it relates directly to what we're talking about here. When he is first joining the Senate, he makes sort of a note to himself in his diary, and it says something like, must get a copy of the Federalist Essays. You know, he's like, oh, I'm in the national government now. I really need to have a copy of those Federalist Essays. And actually he says, wait a minute, it's even better. Must get a copy of Federalist Essays and find a way to get it without paying for it. Someone must give me a copy of this thing because I don't want to buy it myself. But at any rate, they're important, but they're deliberately making points to be a persuasive document. Now, all of that said about impeachment, about thinking carefully about what it is and its meaning, about actually reading what it says, about looking at precedent before the United States and in its use in the United States, there are other ways in which it's important, and some of them I've hinted at in what I've just talked about. One of them has to do, and it goes back to that statement that I made about a good magistrate will not fear impeachment, but a bad one ought to be kept in fear of them, right? So, and this is yet another one of those words I've used a lot in the last year, and that is accountability. Regardless of conviction, and again, it makes perfect sense that everyone is focused on conviction, conviction, conviction. Part of the importance of impeachment is the way that it enforces accountability in a multitude of ways. So first, yeah, you know, it is a threat hovering over a president. Of course, it's only a threat if the president cares about the fact that it's hovering. So accountability in that sense, you know, it's kind of flexible. But also accountability to the American public. And what we're seeing now, and granted this has to do with the technology that we have in front of us now, but what we're seeing is that kind of accountability. It puts me in mind of something that a member of Congress says and I can't remember, I'm at the point now where I can't remember from saying this to classes or during interviews or to you. So forgive me if I've said this already here, but it's so on target. There's yet another moment of congressional violence, and someone says, let's have an investigative committee to investigate what happens. And someone else says, oh, come on. Nothing ever happens during these. We have a committee. The committee makes recommendations. They're not acted on. Why bother? And one member of Congress says, here's why we bother. We bother because, number one, having a committee, organizing it, having it meet and do what a committee does shows the public that Congress is taking a matter in hand and considers it important, number one. And number two, even more important, any kind of investigation of that sort collects the facts together, puts them there for the record, and he doesn't say this, but in our case, it's true, potentially, puts them before the American public. That matters, right? So some of what's going on here has to do with accountability in a lot of different ways with a lot of different meanings. Not every impeachment has been this public. Some have, like Andrew Johnson's impeachment trial, they gave out tickets. It was so popular. I think they allowed like 1,000 people per day to come and watch what was going on. So there have been some that have been great sort of public events. They haven't all been, but the idea of accountability, of the holding the president accountable for his or her actions and offering the public an understanding of what's going on to help hold that president, their servant, accountable. That's part of what we're seeing here, which is, regardless of whether a president considers himself accountable, it matters. It still matters. So I want to enforce that because there's so much, there's a lot of, logically enough, there are a lot of people that I've seen, even just on social media, who are essentially saying, why, a kind of a version of what I just said, why are we doing this since he's not going to get convicted or anything, he's going to get acquitted, it doesn't matter, and if he's acquitted, what does it mean, and what about the future, and logical arguments. And I guess part of why I chose to talk about this today is, yes, all of that is true. I agree with that. And I have my own moments of anger and outrage and frustration, which sometimes require a martini, I will confess. But in addition to that, all of this matters because the process matters. And we have to dig our way out of this moment. We have to find a way to bolster ourselves against something like this happening again. We're in the middle of that crisis, but that doesn't mean that what's going on now doesn't have importance. It does. So conviction isn't, you know, it is ostensibly the goal, but it's not the only goal. It's not the only purpose. And where, you know, the simple fact that we're watching, or many of us are watching, or at least catching up on what's going on, looking at what people are saying. I don't know about you folks out there, but I was teaching this week, so I could only watch portions. But I watched a chunk of the opening day, and, you know, it's not as though I've forgotten what I felt like on January 6th, but I felt a lot of things all over again watching that. And it was a sort of really useful reminder about this is, you know, in a sense, this is the crime. This is what happened. Remember this, America? Here it is. It's on video. We're collecting it together for the record. You can all see this again. And now we will talk about what that means. The ending might not be what we want it to be, whatever we want the ending to be. But the fact that this is happening matters. It would be far more serious and far worse if we didn't bother with it because we knew there would be no conviction, which we don't know. But regardless, even if we knew for sure there could not possibly be a conviction, not going through this process would be far more severe and would have far more dire implications than going through it and not really being sure that anything was going to come of it. The one last point I want to make before I open things up again, which I skipped over, but it's important to make because it has to do with meanings and words and definitions in the Constitution. When I was talking about high crimes and misdemeanors, and I was talking about how first they talked about maladministration, and then they thought, well, that's too broad. High crimes and misdemeanors, and there's history and precedent for that. A point I wanted to make, and this has to do with the fact that they were making a constitution that they assumed would be in power for whoever knows how long, but that was not only going to apply for the next 10 or 20 years. there were aspects of the Constitution that were deliberately fuzzy because of that very reason, right? So for example, think about the idea of federalism, this brilliant fuzzy thing in the Constitution. People were really afraid of national anythings, right? National is scary. National made people at the time think their state was going to get absorbed by the national government. So the Constitution doesn't talk about national things. It talks about federal things. Federal is less scary. Federal's pretty blurry. We still deal all the time with that blurriness, right? What should be given to the states to figure out? What should be given to the national government to figure out? It changes all the time. It gets bounced around. Things go to the Supreme Court over this issue. It was deliberately fuzzy because that was a sort of brilliant compromise that enabled people to feel okay about the power being invested in the Constitution. And I think high crimes and misdemeanors, there's historical precedent for it, unlike federalism in the way that they're using it, which they were partly constructing in the moment. But that said, the fuzziness of it is part of its constitutional usefulness, as much as it's frustrating for us now. That's worth bearing in mind as well, is that, again, context and where the words appear and why the words appear and other moments in which things are not precisely defined, that there's a logic behind that. Okay, I'm going to stop talking because I see that we are coming up against the time when I normally stop talking, and because I want to open things up for folks to ask questions. I'm going to move this over so I can see what folks are saying. Oh, Gina, it's your first time here. Thank you. I always applaud people. Oh, thank you, Carolee. Okay, for those who are new, 44 weeks, and every week I have a different mug, or I use a mug that relates to what I'm talking about. I don't have unique mugs anymore, but still, every week, and every week I forget to do this. And it's sitting next to me. Okay, thank you, Carolee. And then after this, Matt has a different background every week. We cannot forget the ritual. Okay, so you will see why this relates. I was stretching for this one. This has to do with the impeachment that's going on right now. It's one last time. It's one last impeachment, one final impeachment. So that was the best I could come up with. Somehow or other, suited the moment. This is actually a mug celebrating Lin-Manuel Miranda's last time as Hamilton. It says on the back the date when he last played Hamilton, and it says #took my shot. But it was meant to refer to this second and final impeachment. Okay, I'm going to now, Matt, you guys have to figure out what the background is.
Tom got it like right away. I was really impressed. So I don't know if I've not seen any other guesses, but I will reveal, of course, that this is from inside the Andrew Johnson house.
I was going to guess that based on nothingness. Just like, if I were going to do this, what would I do? That was it.
Well, it was either this or I was going to use background for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which I couldn't figure out how to do without actively traumatizing people. So I went with Andrew Johnson for today. So all right.
When you stood up, I was kind of like,
yeah, you can
yeah. So anyway, but an excellent choice.
I almost went with, there's another picture of the dining room, which I thought was lovely, but it looked like my grandmother's dining room from when I was growing up. So I was like, I can't just have that in the background because I'll be thinking about, grandma and grandpa's house. So.
It's an excellent choice. I applaud the background. I applaud your grandparents too, but I applaud the background. So, okay.
All right. Well, we're going to turn to questions now. We have about 8 questions in there, so we're doing good. But if you do have questions, make sure you put them in the Q&A. And my weekly threat remains intact, which is if we run out of questions, poor Joanne is going to have to suffer through my questions.
And I contradict that every week.
And she contradicts that every week. But nonetheless, yeah, Carolee, I grew up in Andrew Johnson's dining room. Let's see. So Jaime asked this question in chat and put it into into the Q&A, and I think it's a good one to start with because there's a process question associated with this, which his question is, can you comment on what Madison, like the founders, would, and again, knowing that there's no such thing as the founders, but still, can you comment on what the founders would think of, it was reported yesterday that Cruz, Graham, and others were meeting with Trump's lawyers yesterday, and about impartiality of the impeachment. I'm less concerned about the commenting on, whether or not that was the effect of that on this particular trial, but in a historical context, is that appropriate? Is that, like, what are the, sort of the nuts and bolts of propriety when it comes to the Senate as the jury?
Which touches on a larger question, which is the Senate as a jury. And the fact that senators and the executive are going to be intermingled with each other. Along with many of you watching coverage of this and discussion of this on TV, there were many people, many pundits coming on and saying, it's not proper, it's not proper. The larger question, which is, what do you do about the fact that there's that intermingling, that this kind of situation, it's hardly, impossible to assume. Part of the answer, I don't have the absolute answer, and as Matt said, there's not one founder blob. But what was interesting was I did go back and read to see Hamilton in the Federalist Essays does a lot of the writing about the executive, the national executive, because he cares about that power. And in some of the essays in which he talks about impeachment, one of the answers that he has is to a question, why are you letting Congress do this? Why don't you let the Supreme Court do this? That would be different, and it's, supposedly above politics, although the Supreme Court is not above politics, but still, that might avoid this problem. And part of his answer is that impeachment is such a significant thing, is such an important thing, it shouldn't be left to 8 or 9 guys to decide. There should be a lot of people in on the decision. There should be, so in his mind, on that level alone, Congress makes sense, which, one might conclude from that he's also partly saying, there are going to be some guys that are going to think improperly, but what matters is that there's a large number of people is what he was worried about. So I don't have the absolute answer, but what I can say is he considered not having Congress and not having people who might be directly in line with the president work on impeachment. And his idea was, no, it's not proper to give it to a handful of people. And he also said, the fact of the matter is that a president can be impeached. He can also be charged with crimes according to the judicial system. Those are 2 different things. And you can't let the same people who might judge his criminality according to the justice system also be the people who judge his impeachment. So that's as close as I can come to a precise answer.
Connie wants to know, should the Senate vote be a secret ballot to avoid, and I assume she's asking because the idea that we would avoid sort of the politics of it and people could vote their conscience?
It's a good question. And I've kind of bounced back and forth on that. Should it be secret or not? On the one hand, part of me thinks that yes, it should be secret, and then people would be free to vote as they want to vote. Part of me thinks, along the lines of what I just said about why it's not just about conviction, it's also about engaging with the public and showing the public what happened, and standing there as someone who's either with or against cases being presented. So I'm not sure. It's a long way of saying I'm not sure if it should be a secret vote. There's an argument for it. But I don't know. I'm not going to give you an absolute answer, because part of me wants people to account for their votes. They are our representatives in one way or another. Part of me wants our representatives to say, I'm voting this way and here's why. So I have my personal feelings are kind of involved in this, but I don't think I have a historian absolute answer for you.
What about the fact that 15 senators or jurors weren't there yesterday? This is from Natalie. How can they fairly take in all this evidence if they weren't there?
Well, one of the things we don't know is they might have been watching from somewhere else. that, and I saw this mentioned yesterday as well, that they weren't there on the floor, but that they could watch from any number of other places what was going on. So we don't absolutely know that they weren't tuned in. And as a matter of fact, there were people who were there, but apparently were engaged in other things, playing with their notebooks or whatever else. So I think we can't absolutely conclude that people who aren't there are just not listening to the arguments. That totally might be true. And that's certainly not unprecedented, that when there's something controversial being debated, that congressmen, members of Congress, like, flee to not have to be there while that's going on. I think it was the Fugitive Slave Act, when a whole bunch of congressmen suddenly had to go to the library. It was like, run! Like, they just didn't want to have to vote for it. And everyone knew that that's what was happening. And Thaddeus Stevens, after the vote was done, told a page, actually said this out loud to a page, "You can go up to the library and tell them it's safe to come back now." So everyone knew what was going on, but we don't absolutely know that people were ignoring it or just choosing not to be present.
Yeah, I think that, that's, I think in some ways that's this whole other conversation about sort of having to stand up and put your name next to a decision, right? Like, and and in a historical context, that becomes a fascinating conversation about the times in which, and not just the legislative branch, but also the executive branch. You have things like the pocket veto and some of those mechanisms that are just designed to avoid those kinds of conversations, and it's always fascinating to get into those. Vicky, first of all, Vicky, welcome. This is her first time here. Yale history major of 1990. So shout out to Yale. If you were writing the closing argument for the House managers, what stirring historical argument would you make?
Wow, that's a question. I mean,
it's a great question. Great.
I was moved by what happened yesterday. I was. What argument would I make? Probably not surprisingly, I would talk about accountability being the essence of democracy. And I would talk about accountability of members of Congress. I would talk about accountability to the public. I would talk about the accountability of the president. I would talk about the meaning of democracy and the fragility of democracy and the ways in which these kinds of decisions can have a profound impact on democracy, and that partisan, what do I want to say, motivations of the moment might seem to have a strong logic to them, but if you're allowing them to affect your views so that you're making a decision not based on the logic and not based on the impact and not based on precedent or implications, but simply based on the immediate moment, you should think about what that means about the choice that you're making and why you are present in Congress. So that's my 2-second guess. And I would of course find something to quote. I don't know if it would be Thomas Paine.
I'll say follow up. Would you have used Thomas Paine or would you have used something else?
I don't know. That's a good question. I thought that Paine quote was really effective. I probably would have used something else, but I'd have to think a little while about what I would use to sort of get across my point. Probably it would be, there are so many quotes from founder-esque folk about the importance of accountability and responsibility, about the very thing that I just said, that I would probably find one of them essentially saying some version of, this can collapse so easily, and it's so vulnerable, and it relies on us. There would be a quote that would let me do that. So I'll just answer very quickly. I was not at Yale in 1991. I got there in 97.
Yes. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. Vicky did say that she was before your time.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so there's several questions, and maybe this is my fault, perhaps. There's some questions on Andrew Johnson, and I don't know how versed you are in Andrew Johnson.
I can try.
You want to try one?
I'll try.
All right. Somebody asked, and I got to find it again now. Was the charge for firing Stanton the only one considered for Johnson? Was that charge really a setup for impeaching Johnson?
So I'll offer a really, really quick and dirty sort of version of Andrew Johnson and his impeachment. At the center of it is the fact that the Tenure of Office Act was passed around that time and basically said that a president had to have the approval of Congress for the appointing people, officers, and for dismissing officers. And Johnson dismissed Stanton and didn't ask for approval, and that was taken as a direct sort of test of this act and a direct confrontation against Congress. So that was kind of a trigger, but there were, I think, 13 articles of impeachment, I believe. And they were, I looked this morning and I didn't read all of them. Some of them were like that, were sort of targeted, he's abusing his power, he's ignoring an act of Congress. Some of them were, one of them said something like, Newbie read them and he's really disappointed in me that I did not.
He's not an Andrew Johnson fan.
He is not an Andrew Johnson fan. One of them was something like Johnson has frequently spoken to and of Congress in a rude voice. It was like he doesn't respect us. Like that was not clearly the most significant and important impeachment charge. Newbie, very strong views about impeachment. So the Johnson question is, I think that the violating the Tenure of Office Act was the trigger, but I think they were looking for reasons. The radical Republicans in Congress specifically were looking for reasons and ways to confront him, and that provided them with the excuse. And then he conveniently did just what one could do to give people an excuse. And in the end, he's not impeached, partly because of at least one person who thought impeachment would damage the office of the presidency, and so I will not impeach.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were a couple of questions about the political ramifications and the political climate of Johnson's. I don't know if you have anything else to offer on that.
I'm sorry, repeat that again.
I'm sorry. There are a couple of questions. Dave Carey, I think one other person I saw on the political climate surrounding Johnson's impeachment and whether or not it was sort of a fate, or I can never pronounce it correctly, that was sort of decided ahead of time.
Well, I mean, it gets back to the point I kind of hinted at earlier, which is, of course, impeachments are partisan. The president belongs to one party, the people of the other party in Congress. So certainly partisan desires and biases were behind some of what was happening. Again, during the first impeachment, that was part of what people were saying as to why we should never impeach anyone, because they would all be partisan. Newbie. But this is the thing with noobs, is that when he does this, it becomes very hard to focus. Any impeachment is going to be partisan, and that's not a reason not to do it. It's just a reason to do it carefully, and I think do it publicly for all of the reasons that we're talking about here.
So maybe can we dig into this idea of the politics surrounding impeachments, and just like you said, that there are two, I'm going off script here, people, FYI.
Oh, okay.
My threat. No, you have really great questions, but I want to dig into this, and there are some germane questions here, which is, thinking about this idea of the politics of it and how it is both political in the sense you described it as Hamilton, that it is
of civil society.
It's an offense against society, but it also, like you mentioned just now, it is political in the sense that they are political parties involved here. And in your talk, you were really deliberate about this, and forgive me if I'm, feel free to, tell me I'm wrong, but you're really deliberate in sort of explaining that there are real purposes for doing this, whether there's a conviction or not. And part of it is this idea of engaging folks into, or getting the crime on the record, right? Earlier, we also talked, so there's a lot of setup here, I apologize, but earlier we did talk a lot about sort of this idea that you have to put your name on something. I guess, what are sort of can we just explore this idea of politics a little bit, or the political parties issue a little bit more? What are the ramifications for a political party that is on the wrong side, so to speak, of impeachment? And what does history tell us about how political parties need to sort of navigate the waters throughout an impeachment process?
I mean,
Is that too heady of a question?
well, I'll give you a sensible response. You tell me if it's heading in the direction of what you were asking.
Okay.
I think let me say two things. Number one, it is important to remember that when the Constitution is being written and when they're talking about impeachment, and yes, they're understanding that there will be partisanship and people will take sides, et cetera, they did not assume that there would be two organized parties. Mm-hmm. So for one thing, they assumed there'd be lots of people with lots of different ideas and they'd organize in different ways, and they weren't naive, but they didn't think, we're doing this and then it'll be two organized parties and they'll bang heads against each other. So that developed later. I think they would have known and understood that partisanship will always be involved in politics, right? And impeachment, that would not surprise them. And I think they also would not be surprised to learn that a party has to navigate its way through an impeachment thinking about the present. I also don't think that that's a surprise or something that they would assume somehow people, would selflessly not think about that. As a matter of fact, that's, when you look at Hamilton and the way he talks about power and the Constitution, part of what he says is, look, people, they're just not going to do the right thing. Humankind does not do the right thing. We're not creating something here with the assumption that humankind will do the right thing. What we're doing is creating something that will channel bad behavior in good directions for society. So he's not, he wouldn't have, and the founders generally wouldn't assume that all of this partisanship and party combat and all that stuff wouldn't be there. I think they in part felt, and I've talked about this a little bit, actually I talked about this a little bit when I was still on Backstory on my podcast. One of the things that they did assume, and Hamilton talks about it a lot in the Federalist Essays, and a lot of the other writers and essays do too, is there was an assumption that attacking, how did he put it? He calls it, I think, attacking a president's fame, by that means reputation, that shame and the possibility of being disgraced before the nation would have an impact on a president's actions. And that they didn't question. And as I said before, that's one of the reasons why a presidential council to them didn't make sense, partly because it wouldn't be efficient and partly because it would take away or weaken the possibility for a president to be shamed that way. I think they would have assumed that rose above party in some ways. I think we always care about issues of reputation in politics, but I think their understanding of that and our understanding of that are two different things. And I think, interestingly, that shapes politics and in some ways maybe has an influence on impeachment as well.
Yeah, you're talking, I was reflecting on Bill Clinton's impeachment and how members of the Senate who were running for re-election in 2000, which was the first federal election after the impeachment, had to account for their behavior during the leading up to the impeachment and of course their vote. And I'm not familiar with how that played out with Andrew Johnson. I wasn't alive, for one.
Really? Despite growing up in Andrew
Johnson's house.
Yeah.
But no, but yeah, so I wonder, when we think about the because like you said, that our founding fathers didn't envision the sort of two-party system that we have in many ways. And so I that is something that's on my mind as I watch sort of how this these last two impeachments have played out, is
the partisanship of
the
it.
partisanship element of it.
Well, I mean, so I talked very briefly about process, and I saw that a few people came late and they were like, what's the point without conviction? And I talked about accountability, putting things on the record, showing the public what happened, and deploying the process and showing that there is a process. That matters. And in some ways, the assumption of the people creating the Constitution and thinking about the Constitution in those early years was that the process was valuable in part because it would be set, right? That there'd be a set process that you could defer to that wouldn't necessarily take you above partisanship, but that would be there regardless of partisanship, and that would enable some people, if they wanted to rise above partisanship and focus on process. That, I talk about this a lot too, and I talk about the Constitution, is that, and I've said this before here, I know that it's very skeletal considering everything that it does, the Constitution. It's very brief. And there's all kinds of assumptions that we've experienced in the last few years about norms. But a lot of what they were assuming in writing that Constitution was the importance of process, of putting that process in action. It's part of why Madison was so deliberate in recording exactly what was happening during the debates, the process of creating the Constitution, because that mattered. And because they recognized that the process they were going through was immensely important and said a lot about the document itself. So I think it's easy for us to lose track of that because, as I know I've also said here before, there are a lot of courses that we automatically have in our mind when we think about early America. Of course, there's a Constitution. Of course, the Constitution was ratified. And of course, we won the revolution. And of course. And of course, at the time, there were no of courses. And because of all of those of courses, I think we forget about the importance of the process and of, as we're doing now, our ability, regardless of partisanship, to revert to that, to hold on to that, and to have that at least guide what's happening above partisanship. Again, we're not above partisanship in this moment, but we never have been really in our history. The question is just, how does process and partisanship, how do they bang up against each other? How do the people playing major roles in any kind of given debate, what do they decide to do? And then what do we do in response?
Mm-hmm.
So.
That's a great lead into my next question. I'm going to try to squeeze in two more questions here, because this one, that's a great lead into this next question, which is a tremendously unfair question.
Oh no! Okay, thanks for warning me, though.
I'm going to warn you, but like 5 people asked it, and you did mention the earlier where the representatives left the floor and were not actually at the vote. They had something else to call them away. So do you think that that there are going to be senators who are inexplicably drawn away from the Senate floor during the vote?
Okay.
Told you it was an unfair question.
It is, but I'll answer it anyway. And I'll answer it based on nothingness. I'll answer it making.
So that was really I don't know if you have any.
No, I don't. I'm basing this entirely on general logic and vague historical precedent, and I'm making no statement about any particular member of Congress. Yes, I do think there will be some people who will not be there.
Interesting.
Who will, and I don't know how many, and I don't know why, but this does not appear to be a moment in which people are holding themselves accountable. So I don't know, but I think particularly given the ways in which loyalty to Trump still plays such a major role and are still shaping very much what people are doing in Congress, and yet I think now they're sort of grappling with how to display that and what it means. It would not surprise me if at least some people just decide that the best way to not put themselves in the middle of that are just for some reason or another to not be there. Now, I don't know if they'll come up with some, my dog ate my homework kind of reason to not be there. I don't know. And I would love to be wrong. But, again, just based on the Fugitive Slave Act and people being like, I'm not going to vote on that. I don't know. It'll be interesting.
It's entirely possible.
It's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
you know, absence from the vote is a way to abstain and avoid accountability. That's the thing, is that this is about accountability, and some people really are not going to want to take some. Actually, okay, so I now feel better because Carolee says Heather Cox Richardson in her blog said senators might be missing. Okay, Heather and
okay.
I, we agree.
Anytime we're agreeing with Heather Cox Richardson is not a bad thing. Okay, so last question in the last 2 minutes here, and a super easy question.
Okay.
But a couple of Gene, I'm leaning on Gene and Tim. I believe Tim was the other one. Yes, Tim and Gene sort of asked the same question. I want to get to it, which is, given all this, and now that we've seen, at least in my lifetime, my very short 20-year lifetime, no, 3 impeachment trials. Does the idea, in your opinion, in your historical opinion, does the process of impeachment need some sort of revision to be more, and I'm going to add this part in, to be more in line with how our founders really thought of
it? I'm not sure what that means.
So the the question they're asking is, I will read Tim's version of it because I think it's just really, really straightforward. And then, because, yeah, no presidents have been convicted as a result of the impeachment process. One president resigned before impeachment. Given these outcomes, does this say something about the usefulness of this process? Does it need some kind of revision? In your expert opinion, do we need to revise the process of impeachment based on our collective history?
Wow. I guess, so first I'll say something general, which is I did an event with Rachel, the historian Rachel Sheldon, and she used a phrase which I thought was really good. So I'm going to take it from her, but I'm crediting her. She talked about how in the past there have been moments of constitutional creativity when it was sort of more understood than it might be now, that you could revise or work with or amend the Constitution in ways that we don't think about now. As a matter of fact, somewhere yesterday, someone was like, well, we can't amend the Constitution. It's like, well, of course we can amend the Constitution. So I mentioned that only because would I say that there should be no change? No. What should the change be if there were a change? I don't know. I think I agree with the argument that it shouldn't go to the Supreme Court for some of the reasons that Hamilton offers in his Federalist Essays. So that said, you know, that do not put me in a constitutional convention. I cannot come up with the answer, but I think it's worth considering and talking about questions like this. I think it's a really good question. So the short answer is, yeah, maybe there's a way to revise it. Oh, there, look at that. Someone's like, there it is, Sheldon and Freeman, boom, the event. You guys are like, pew, pew. So yeah, I'm going to offer that. I'm going to close with that sort of general statement, which is, might it need to be revised in some way or amended in some way? It might. I don't know how to do that if the goal there is to take it above partisanship, since even at the beginning, it was not above partisanship. It's just the partisanship looked different. So I'm not sure if in a democratic mode of governance, you can escape partisanship. I don't actually know that.
Well, I think that's a great place to end for the day. And we are 2 minutes over the 11 o'clock. So I will say my piece and then turn it over, Joanne, to end for today.
And actually, before people go away, because they start to go away, and then I will turn things back to you. But for those of you who are new here, since there are a bunch, we are going to segue into the after party. So don't flee. If you would like to stay for the after party, just stay where you are. And now I will shut up and you can conclude and then come back to me and I will conclude. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, don't run away, because there's other I don't want to say more interesting, but really interesting things happening. And so the after party is definitely coming. So if you are here, please stay with us for the after party. We'll stop recording and go off Facebook. Sorry, Facebook people, and have a rather informal conversation where we interact with you guys just a little bit more. In the meantime, thank you, Joanne. As always, this is an important conversation given what's going on, and it's a conversation that's going to resonate with us for a long time. And so we really thank you for your insights today. It's super helpful for me. And as always, if you like what we're doing here, please join us at National Council for History Education. We're try to make sure to do good work in all things history and history education, to try to just demonstrate the importance of the teaching and learning of diverse histories. So please make sure that you join us, www.ncheteach.org, or you can join us on social media. At History Ed is our Twitter handle, and NC4HE is where you can find us on Facebook. So thank you, everybody, and I will turn to Joanne to end the day.
Okay. As always, and just as Matt said, thank you all for joining us again in the History Matters community. Obviously, we will be here next Friday, and one of the interesting things about living at this time is that I have absolutely no idea what will seem topical and timely, because who knows what will happen in the next 7 days. But we will be here. And as always, on Twitter, we'll be talking in advance about what we'll be talking about and what topic will come up. As I also say every week, and I'll say it again here, it's so important to have forums where we can have these kinds of conversations in these moments where particularly things are happening of enormous historical significance. And there's so many words out there and so much pontificating, and so much of it isn't necessarily valuable as other aspects of it. I just think, you know, as I saw someone talk about Joanne historian brain and Joanne citizen brain. Yeah, there is those. I do have part of my brain is doing one and the other. Both of those brains, historian brain and citizen brain, both think that what we do here every week is really important. So I will close on that. As I said before, stick around, the after party. It's just, we don't record. It's just less formal. We have more of a conversation and it lasts about a half hour. So do stick around. And otherwise I will see you guys next week.
See you, everybody.